Hi, Tim Crosby here. And I have one of my favorite topics today to talk about. I'm going to start by telling a story. Um, when I was probably 13-ish, I had a little pushback go round with my music teacher because I was a diligent practicer and I did my homework and I did all that stuff. But I came into my music lesson and I said, Mr. Beck, I said, I'm really tired of just playing scales. I want to play a song. Okay, here's the interesting thing. What he should have said, what he did say was, shook his finger at me and said, no, you're just going to keep playing these scales and scale exercises. What he should have said is, oh, you already are playing songs because all songs are made up of bits and pieces of scales and arpeggios. So the more of those that you do, the more songs you'll know. When you start learning a new song, your fingers, your brain is going to say, oh, this part I already know because I've been practicing it. But he didn't tell me that. And I grumbled about it and pushed back mentally against playing scales until later I discovered for myself that songs are made up of bits of scales and arpeggios. So that's going to be the topic. And it applies to all instruments. Doesn't matter if you play the piano or the hurdy-gurdy or the mandolin or the violin, because it's a scale is a scale, music is music, and it's just what instrument that I was playing. I was a trumpet player at the time, or cornet player. So I want to talk about just kind of the fundamental place to start working on scales, and that's do, re, mi, your basic. Yeah, do, a deer, a female deer. That's your basic major scale. So where do you go from there? Well, one of the things that you can do that I think is really useful is you can start getting sort of the theory concept of what a scale is. Our scale and almost all human music for 65,000 years has mostly been made up of the same notes and the same relationships of notes. The way we describe it is between the first note of the scale and the second note, there's a whole step. On a fretted instrument, that's 2 frets. There's a whole step between 2 and 3. There's a half step between 3 and 4. Then there's a whole step between 4 and 5, 5 and 6, 6 and 7, and then there's another half step. Now, the reason I use the number 65,000 years, there's a really interesting documentary you can find on YouTube about a bone flute that was dug up in a cave in Carpathia at the 65,000 years ago level, made by Neanderthals. It's made out of a little chunk of the thigh bone of a young cave bear, as they said. But it's got holes drilled in it and notches in the side of it. And they figured out that it's in fact what's called a pot flute, like an ocarina today. They gave a replica of it to an ocarina virtuoso, this Hungarian guy, and he can play Mozart. I kid you not, but find the documentary, 65 Neanderthal bone flute or cave bear bone flute, something like that. It's astonishing because that's the way the universe vibrates. So we learn these scales. Now, of course, not all songs are made up of straight up and down the scale, unless you're singing do, a deer. So then the next step with scales is, learn them in different keys. So on stringed instruments, there are different fingering patterns. So this on the mandolin or the violin happens to be the pattern for a 2-octave G scale because it starts on the open G string. You can start on A, the pattern is different. And there are fairly long discussions about learning the different patterns for the different keys. That was A, B flat would be here. And those are all good to do. get the patterns, straight up the scale, straight down the scale. Then, kind of the fun part begins when you start doing, there's a whole series of what are called, a lot of people call them folded scales. These little scale exercises where you combine the notes of the scale in different patterns. Two of my favorites are, one of them I call it the leapfrog scale. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, you're gonna skip 2 and go 1, 3, drop back to 2, 4, 3, 5, 4, 6, like that. You heard it. Let me play it again without talking. And then you go back the other way. So that's the leapfrog scale. My other favorite is, I call it 3 up and back. So you play the first 3 notes of the scale, and then you drop back to where you started. So it's in little 4 note patterns. So you go 1, 2, 3, 1, and then step up, 2, 3, 4, 2. And then go back the other way. Do that in several different keys to start getting those patterns. And now it starts to sound more like music, like songs. Oh, there's a variation on the 3 up and back, because I came up in the fiddling world and the bluegrass world. I call it the blackberry blossom scale pattern. And it's go. But now, although you're going up the scale and dropping back, instead of stepping each beginning note up the scale, you go down the scale with your beginning note. So you're going. And that first little bit is note for note, the fiddle tune, Blackberry Blossom. And then they don't continue the whole pattern. So those 3 folded scales, I highly recommend to you. Leapfrog, 3 up and back, 3 down and back, and the Blackberry Blossom. And then the last bit of it is to finish out all of your scales, whether it's just the straight do, re, mi, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or one of the folded scales, finish it with what's called an arpeggio. The arpeggio, or another way to think of it, on an instrument that you can play chords with, it's the 3 notes that make up a major chord. Or another way to describe it is the first note, the 3rd note, and the 5th note of the scale. So if we're numbering this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then you just play 1, and then 3, 5, 1. And you've heard that before. Get it in your hands, get it in your mind, because those are the notes that make up a major chord. So there's a whole discussion about scales, major scales, straight up and down scale, folded scales, arpeggios. One of the next one of these videos, we're going to take another step in the scales and talk about pentatonic scales. Here's the preview. If you've numbered your scale notes, the trick with pentatonics is you'll leave out 2 of the numbered notes in the scale. We'll get to that next time. Glad you're here. I'm Tim Crosby. Play your scales, and remember, they're songs.